The steady hum of New Orleans nightlife seemed distant as Detective Ellington pulled up to the crime scene on Royal Street. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the historic French Quarter buildings, casting long, eerie shadows. The early morning air was thick with moisture, carrying the faint scent of jasmine mixed with the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, drawn by morbid curiosity, but the police had cordoned off the area, leaving Ellington to step into the scene alone. As Ellington approached the doorway of the house, a uniformed officer greeted him with a somber nod. "Detective Ellington, glad you're here," the officer said, lifting the crime scene tape for him to duck under. "Husband found her. Name's Samantha Leroy, 30 years old, married to James Leroy. Husband says he came home from work and found her like this." Ellington looked up at the house, the front porch bathed in the harsh glow of streetlights. He knew this area well. Tourists usually packed these streets, reveling in the music and history that clung to every corner of the French Quarter. But tonight, there was only silence, broken by the muffled sobs of James Leroy, who sat on the front steps, hunched over as if trying to fold into himself. Ellington crouched beside him. "Mr. Leroy, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions." James looked up, his eyes red and swollen, his face streaked with tears. I don't understand. I just got home. She was already. He choked on the words, his hands shaking as he gestured helplessly toward the doorway. "Take your time," Ellington said softly, glancing toward the house. The living room, visible through the open door, was soaked in shadows and the eerie glow of crime scene lights. James took a deep, ragged breath. "I was on the night shift. I'm an EMT, you see. I came home around 3 a.m. and found her. Like that." He clenched his fists. "I don't understand why anyone would do this to her. She was a good person." Ellington stood, leaving James to his grief for the moment. He stepped inside, immediately struck by the smell of iron and decay. Samantha Leroy's body lay in the middle of the living room, drenched in blood. Her face, peaceful in its stillness, stood in stark contrast to the violent scene around her. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the floorboards, and it had splattered onto the walls in wide arcs, painting a gruesome portrait. As Ellington examined the scene, something shifted in his mind. His synesthesia began to take hold. To others, synesthesia might be a curiosity, a quirk. But for Ellington, it was a tool. He saw sounds and colors, felt emotions and textures, and sometimes clues revealed themselves to him in hues and patterns no one else could perceive. At the crime scene, the overwhelming color was red. Not just the blood, but an angry, pulsating red that seemed to vibrate in the air. The red told him this was a crime of passion. The brutality of the scene screamed rage, and rage, he knew, often came from those who felt wronged. As his gaze moved around the room, faint streaks of blue began to emerge. Calm, cold, methodical. These were not the traces of a simple outburst. There was something else here, something premeditated. "Detective," a voice called from behind him. Ellington turned to see Officer Daniels standing in the doorway. "We found something in the bedroom you might want to see." Ellington followed Daniels down the narrow hallway to the back of the house. The bedroom was small, with neatly arranged furniture and soft lighting. On the bed, a stack of papers had been left, their edges frayed from handling. At first glance, they appeared to be simple documents, but as Ellington sifted through them, the truth began to unfold. Samantha Leroy was not born Samantha. Her birth name had been Samuel Johnson. Ellington's brow furrowed as he processed the information. It was no small detail. The discovery of Samantha's past added a new layer to the investigation. Her transition from Samuel to Samantha raised immediate questions. Had her husband known? And if he hadn't, how would he have reacted to learning such a significant truth? He walked back toward the front of the house, his mind racing. James was still sitting on the steps, clutching his head in his hands. Ellington knelt beside him again. "James, did you know about Samantha's past?" Ellington asked, his tone careful but direct. James blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Her past? What do you mean?" Ellington hesitated for a moment, but the time for subtlety had passed. "Samantha, she wasn't always Samantha. She was born Samuel." For a moment, James stared at him, confusion clouding his grief-stricken face. What are you saying?" Ellington watched him carefully. There was no immediate flicker of recognition, no flash of anger or shock. "She transitioned. Did you know?" James shook his head slowly, as though trying to make sense of it. No, I didn't know." His voice cracked. "Why didn't she tell me? Why would she keep that from me?" Ellington watched James' reaction closely, trying to gauge the authenticity of his confusion. If James had truly been unaware, then the revelation could either exonerate him or push him deeper into suspicion. But for now, Ellington had no reason to disbelieve him. The shock seemed genuine. "Mr. Leroy," Ellington said gently, "I need to ask you something else. Have there been any tensions between you and Samantha recently? Any arguments?" James wiped his eyes and shook his head. "No. We had normal arguments like any couple, but nothing serious. Nothing that would lead to this." Ellington nodded, mentally cataloging the information. He had more work to do, more people to question. But there was something in James' sadness, something in the muted blue color of his emotions, that told Ellington he wasn't the man they were looking for. At least not yet. Ellington rose from his crouched position and looked back at the house. He knew the next step would be to dig deeper into Samantha's life, her secrets, and the relationships that could have led to her untimely death. There was always more beneath the surface, more to the story than anyone wanted to admit. But one thing was clear. Samantha Leroy had been running from something or someone, and now Ellington was going to find out who. The characteristic humidity of New Orleans still hung in the air as Ellington stepped out of the Leroy house and made his way to his car. His mind was filled with unanswered questions. The discovery of Samantha's past identity was only the first link in a chain of secrets that seemed to have followed her to her death. Did James really not know the truth? Or was there something darker that had yet to surface? Ellington decided to begin his investigation by speaking with someone close to Samantha who could offer more context. The name May Johnson, the Leroy family's neighbor and friend, had come up in several conversations. From what Ellington had been told, May had been a close friend of Samantha for years. If anyone knew about Samantha's secrets, it would be her. May's house was only a few streets away. When Ellington arrived, the facade showed a small home adorned with climbing plants covering the brick walls. May greeted him with a serious but unsurprised expression. It seemed she had been expecting his visit. "Detective Ellington," May said as she invited him inside. "I figured you'd come to talk to me." "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Johnson," Ellington replied, observing the modest but cozy home. "I know this situation must be difficult, but I need to know more about Samantha and her life. I understand you were one of her closest friends." May nodded, her gaze drifting toward a photo on the wall. In the picture, Samantha smiled, her eyes full of life, holding a glass at what appeared to be a party. May looked at the image with sadness before turning back to Ellington. Samantha was a strong woman, but also very private. She didn't talk much about her past. I knew something was haunting her, but she never wanted to go into detail. I always thought she did it to protect those around her. And, of course, that included James. Ellington watched her closely. Did she ever mention whether James knew about her past? May shook her head. No, she never brought it up. But I know she was worried about it. She always told me that James was her everything, that he had helped her rebuild her life. But she also lived in constant fear that if he ever found out the truth, everything would fall apart. She was terrified of losing him. The answer was revealing, but it raised even more questions. If Samantha had been so worried about keeping her secret, was it possible that someone else had discovered it? Someone who had threatened her or used that secret against her? Do you know if Samantha had any complicated relationships with anyone else? Someone who might have known the truth? Ellington asked, focusing on potential external threats. May frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I'm not sure, but I know there was one person, Tony, the bartender at the Blue Oyster Bar. She used to spend a lot of time there, especially when she was feeling anxious or needed space. I don't think James knew, but Tony, well, he had feelings for Samantha. Everyone knew, but she never reciprocated. Still, they remained friends. If anyone knew everything about her, it would be Tony. Ellington thanked May for her time and headed to the Blue Oyster Bar. The place was on the edge of the French Quarter, an unassuming but well-known bar among the local community. The neon lights announcing the name flickered faintly, reflecting off the wet pavement of the sidewalk. Inside, the atmosphere was intimate and somewhat dim, with the soft sound of scattered conversations and jazz music playing in the background. Ellington walked directly to the bar where Tony, a stocky middle-aged man with a well-groomed beard, was cleaning a glass with a cloth, his expression deep and thoughtful. "Tony?" Ellington asked as he approached. The bartender looked up and nodded. "Yeah, that's me. What can I do for you?" Ellington pulled out his badge and showed it to him. "I'm Detective Ellington. I'm investigating the death of Samantha Leroy. I need to ask you a few questions." Tony's face darkened immediately. He set the glass aside and nodded slowly. "Samantha, this is a tragedy. I can't believe she's gone. May Johnson told me you were very close to Samantha. I'd like to know more about your relationship with her." Tony sighed and leaned on the bar, looking at the floor for a moment before speaking. "Samantha was special. I met her before her transition, Samuel, as I knew her back then. She was someone who was always fighting to be herself, to find her place in the world. When she decided to transition, I supported her every step of the way. I helped her with whatever she needed, emotionally and financially, but it was never romantic between us. I loved her, but she didn't see me that way." Ellington noticed the glimmer of sadness in Tony's eyes. "Did she ever tell you she was afraid that James would find out about her past?" "Yes," Tony replied firmly. "She feared that more than anything in the world. She didn't want him to know, and I would never tell him. I swore to myself. Sometimes she would come here when she was nervous, when she thought everything was going to come crashing down. She told me she felt trapped between who she was and what she was afraid of losing." Tony's confession confirmed what Ellington had already suspected. Samantha had lived with a constant fear of being discovered. But it was still unclear whether James had found out on his own or if someone else had used that secret against her. "Do you know any reason why someone would want to hurt her?" Ellington asked, his tone more severe now. Tony hesitated before answering. "I don't know for sure, but Samantha received money. Large amounts. I don't know where it came from, but she used it to pay for her surgeries and her life after the transition. She never told me where it came from, but I always had the feeling that there was a price." Ellington frowned. The anonymous money transfers were a crucial lead. If Samantha had received money to fund her transition, who had sent it and why? Was it connected to her death? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but many questions remained unanswered. As Ellington left the bar, the rain began to fall over the streets of New Orleans, heightening the heavy atmosphere surrounding the case. The detective knew he needed to dig deeper into Samantha's finances and find out more about the mysterious source of the money. The clues were beginning to converge, but with every answer, more secrets and buried lies emerged. And something told him that Samantha wasn't the only one hiding something. The rain fell steadily over New Orleans, turning the streets slick and reflective under the dim streetlights. Detective Ellington leaned against his car, his mind racing with the pieces of the puzzle he had gathered so far. Samantha Leroy's past, the money, the secrets. Everything pointed to a web of complicated relationships and hidden truths. But one thing was becoming clearer. This wasn't just a crime of passion. There was something far deeper at play, and someone was hiding a deadly secret. Ellington knew his next move. He had to dig into Samantha's finances and find out more about the mysterious money transfers Tony had mentioned. Back at the precinct, he sat down with his colleague, Officer Daniels, who had been combing through Samantha's bank records. "Ellington, take a look at this," Daniels said, handing him a printout of transactions. "There are several large deposits made into Samantha's account over the last few years, all anonymous. But here's where it gets interesting. There's a pattern. The deposits started right around the time she began her transition, and the amounts match almost exactly what she would have needed for her surgeries." Ellington scanned the document, his synesthesia kicking in as he analyzed the information. The deposits felt cold, calculated, a shade of icy blue in his mind. Whoever was behind the money was methodical, but there was no hint of emotion. No anger, no passion, just control. Whoever sent this money had a vested interest in Samantha's transition, Ellington muttered, more to himself than to Daniels. But why? What was the connection? Daniels nodded. "We've traced the transactions back to a shell company. It doesn't exist, just a front. Whoever set this up was careful." Ellington leaned back in his chair, thinking. Samantha had been receiving this money for years, but she had never told anyone where it came from. Not even Tony, the man who had been by her side throughout the entire process. The question remained, who would have such a deep connection to Samantha's life before her transition, and what lengths would they go to in order to keep that secret buried? The next name that came to Ellington's mind was Dr. Morrow, the surgeon who had performed Samantha's gender reassignment surgery. Ellington had learned through interviews that Dr. Morrow had a reputation for being discreet, but also for operating in some gray areas of legality. If anyone had a direct link to the money and Samantha's past, it would be him. Ellington wasted no time. He drove to Dr. Morrow's private clinic, a sleek and modern building tucked away in an affluent part of the city. As he stepped inside, the receptionist greeted him politely, but Ellington quickly flashed his badge, cutting straight to business. "I need to speak with Dr. Morrow," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. A few moments later, Dr. Morrow appeared. He was a tall, imposing man in his mid-50s with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp, calculating eyes. There was something about him that immediately set Ellington on edge. A sense of detachment, like the doctor saw people as projects rather than human beings. "Detective," Dr. Morrow said, his tone smooth but cold. "I've been expecting a visit. I assume this is about Samantha Leroy." Ellington nodded. "You performed her surgery. I need to know more about your relationship with her and why someone was funneling large sums of money into her account. Was it connected to you?" Dr. Morrow smirked slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I'm afraid my relationship with Samantha was purely professional. She came to me for a service and I provided it. As for the money, I have no idea what you're talking about." Ellington's instincts flared up. He knew when someone was lying, and Dr. Morrow's detached demeanor screamed deceit. But Morrow was careful, too careful. He wasn't going to crack under basic questioning. "You knew Samantha as Samuel Johnson, didn't you?" Ellington pressed. "Before she transitioned. You must have known about her past, maybe even more than she shared with those closest to her. Did you have any dealings with her before the surgery?" Dr. Morrow's expression faltered ever so slightly, a brief flicker of something darker behind his eyes. It was enough for Ellington to sense that he had hit a nerve. "I don't see how that's relevant to her murder, Detective," Morrow said, his voice tight. "Oh, I think it's very relevant," Ellington replied, stepping closer. "You see, Samantha wasn't just afraid of being discovered by her husband. She was running from something or someone, and I'm starting to think that someone is you." Dr. Morrow's face hardened, but he remained silent. Ellington continued. "You performed the surgery. You had access to every detail of her life before and after the transition. And those anonymous payments, they didn't come from a faceless company. They came from someone trying to control her. My guess? You had something to hide from Samantha's past life. And when she wanted to move forward, you couldn't let her. So, you made sure she stayed quiet. Dr. Morrow's eyes flashed with anger, and he took a step back, his composure slipping. You don't know what you're talking about. Ellington pressed on, feeling the tension build. What was it, Morrow? Illegal operations? Something that Samuel knew? And when Samantha started to gain her independence, you realized she was a threat. You couldn't risk her exposing you. Morrow's hands clenched into fists. Samantha didn't know what she was getting into. Ellington interrupted. She trusted you, but you killed her to keep her from revealing your secrets. Morrow's silence was enough of an answer. Before Ellington could push further, his phone buzzed. It was Officer Daniels. Ellington, we got a tip. James Leroy and Mae Johnson were spotted at an old jazz club on the outskirts of town. You need to get there now. Ellington's mind raced. What were James and Mae doing together, especially at a place so out of character for both of them? He didn't waste time. Leaving Dr. Morrow behind for the moment, he raced to his car and drove through the slick streets of New Orleans, his thoughts swirling. When he arrived at the abandoned jazz club, the building loomed in the rain, its old wooden doors barely hanging on their hinges. Inside, Ellington found Mae and James huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Detective, Mae stammered. We didn't mean for it to happen. Ellington's heart pounded. What are you talking about? Mae glanced at James, who was shaking. The money. We supported Samantha financially. But when things started to fall apart, James found out. He lost control. I didn't know what to do. It all clicked into place. James had learned the truth about Samantha, and in his rage and confusion, he had gone to confront her. But it wasn't James who had killed her. The true killer was still out there. At that moment, Ellington heard a noise behind him. He turned to see Dr. Morrow, holding a gun, his face twisted in fury. You should have stayed out of this, Detective, Morrow growled. Before Ellington could react, a shot rang out, and Dr. Morrow collapsed to the ground, his gun clattering beside him. Officer Daniels stood behind him, gun drawn, his face grim. It's over, Ellington, Daniels said. We got him. Ellington looked down at Morrow's body, the rain washing over the scene. The case was solved, but the damage was done. Samantha's life, filled with secrets, lies, and struggles, had come to a tragic end. But at least now she could rest. In the aftermath, Ellington attended a jazz festival where Mae and James performed together, their music carrying a somber yet hopeful tone. The case had taught him something about love, identity, and the human capacity to both destroy and heal. Samantha's story would stay with him, a reminder that the truth always finds a way to emerge, no matter how deeply buried it might be.
Welcome to Real Crime Family, your ultimate destination for gripping true crime documentaries. Explore real-life mysteries, criminal investigations, and shocking stories from around the world. Our channel covers notorious cases, unsolved crimes, and in-depth analysis of the criminal mind. Each documentary is carefully crafted to provide a realistic, engaging, and thought-provoking look at the world of true crime. Subscribe and join us as we explore the dark side of human nature, the justice system, and the detectives who search for the truth. New episodes every night.